Sunset Devils is one of my most anticipated upcoming projects. There's so much to praise in terms of its design, from its art direction, to its gameplay, to the quiet moments between the set pieces and the combat. The basic structure of the experience leaves a massive amount of room for interesting exploration and enemy encounters, and the demo proves much of that potential already, even this early into design. If anything I say about this game sounds compelling, I highly recommend taking a look at the Kickstarter, which just launched recently. You can download the demo for free there, and if you're enjoying yourself, throw a dime towards the creators to help breathe some life into this project. To begin, I want to talk about the weapon mechanics. In many ways, this is the central pillar of Sunset Devil's Temple. So many of the other design decisions are reliant on how the player manages their guns. To put it simply, each firearm isn't reloaded or rearmed with the medium standard single button press. Instead, each weapon has a multi-step process that requires the player to take all the actions that would go into reloading that particular gun in the real world. Let's take the Derringer, for example. It's the first firearm you're granted access to in the beta, and as such, it's more mechanically simple than some others. Assuming you're playing with a mouse and keyboard, first we break it open by flicking the mouse scroll wheel upwards, then insert 2 cartridges with mouse 1 and 2. Spinning the scroll wheel down unbreaks the gun, and doing it again cocks the hammer. All that's left to do now is fire, then arm the hammer again, then shoot your remaining shot. Keep in mind, the Derringer is lower on the scale of complexity than most of the other weapons already in the game. Guns like the single-action revolver, for example, can take up to 21 inputs to be able to fully ready the firearm if you have a full cylinder of empty shells. Now, all this may seem overly complicated to anyone that hasn't played the game. What benefit could having this convoluted of a setup entail? Well, by my reckoning, there's 3 major reasons this system is so well integrated into the experience as a whole. The first, and largest, is that it forces the player to place themselves in the shoes of their character as they operate their weapons. Mistiming one of these inputs can have a variety of negative effects, from closing the chamber too early, to fumbling a live cartridge onto the ground, to simply failing that action. Each button press is easy on its own, but combine them together and you get a system that can be decently punishing. Because of this, there's a push and pull between attempting to be careful and calculated with your reloads such that nothing goes wrong, and flying through the steps as fast as possible to be ready for potential enemies advancing on your position. As you improve, you'll become faster, smoother, and less prone to error than you were at the beginning. On top of this, there isn't a counter to check how many rounds are remaining in your weapon. That's another aspect of gun management the player is forced to pay closer attention to than most other games. There's a ton of room for player skill expression specifically because all these areas seem so clunky on their faces. Put another way, Sunset Devil's gun management is exceptionally mechanically immersive. The system strongly incentivizes a deeper understanding of how these things function than many similar titles. The specifics of how each weapon is controlled are also conducive to regular immersion as well. Talking about the keyboard controls here, the layout of the buttons on a mouse leaves the door open for a surprisingly real-life accurate methodology for controlling firearms. For guns that break open to feed fresh rounds into the chambers, flicking up on the scroll wheel replicates the downward movement of doing so in the real world. For guns that don't do so, this action is used for a variety of understandable representations, such as closing the cylinder on a revolver or opening the lever on a lever gun. Right-click is used to fill in the gaps, from loading new rounds into the lever action to opening the window on a single action. Any analysis of this wouldn't be complete without special mention to how the hammer is manipulated. The decision to have cocking the hammer be controlled with the scroll wheel is a stroke of genius. Spinning it backwards near perfectly represents the mechanism. It's a bit of a stretch, but the action of moving the mouse around to take aim could also be said to better reflect the action of aiming than other shooters, as Sunset Devils presents the mouse as a mechanical representation of a gun more rigorously than any other game I've played. All this is to say that handling the buttons on your mouse is intentionally reminiscent of the same actions on an actual gun, and the conflation of the two has had a positive effect for Sunset Devil's immersive qualities. The game's controller functionality can't replicate this sort of physical oneness with a Western firearm, of course, but it's probably a good idea to include support for alternate control methods regardless. At the very least, controller players still feel the effects of mechanical immersion the same. A second reason supporting this system is that it creates memorable moments and engaging play experiences while fighting enemies. This is another aspect that comes as a result of its somewhat clunky nature. Earlier, I said that there's a balancing act required when reloading. where the player will want to be swift yet precise. The tension between the two goals can produce interesting scenarios, where a player has a need to reload their weapon ASAP, but may not want to risk pushing themselves too quickly lest they make a mistake and end up worse off than they would have been otherwise. This introduces a lot of tension, understandably, which means the game tends to be much more engaging in combat than it might be otherwise. As there is more to keep track of than similar shooters, the player also has to place more focus on making the right moves than those games. Also, the possibility of failure with these systems can give rise to moments that wouldn't happen otherwise. Messing up a reload in the middle of a firefight can feel downright thrilling, if a bit panic-inducing. On the flip side of that coin, nailing your reload and winning in a spectacular fashion because of that fact can feel so satisfying because it wasn't guaranteed. Because performing the most basic actions related to your weapons isn't a surefire thing, it allows the player to claim full responsibility for that win when they get it right. Displaying the required inputs off in the corner as opposed to somewhere more central also helps the general feel of gameplay in a way that I'm not sure was intentional, but nevertheless adds to the experience. If you're unfamiliar with a weapon, you have to take your eyes away from anything else happening on screen to focus in on the bottom right. What this means is that you're far more vulnerable to surprise attack if you're not in combat, and unable to both focus on enemy placement and gunfire if you are. It gives the player another thing to improve at, strengthening the already well-considered inconveniences of having to micromanage your weapons. Over the course of play, players will go from intently staring at the corner to understand what they need to do next, to confidently and concisely doing the actions required to the point where they don't really need to look at the display when reloading at all, significantly increasing their situational awareness. Plus, it adds to that sense of oneness with the character that I described before. Reloading a firearm in real life, especially period-accurate guns such as those found in Sunset Devils, takes a good amount of precise movement and time. Looking away from the action mimics looking at your firearm in the real world, a great use of dividing the player's attention to increase the immersive aspects of gun maintenance. I want to wrap up talking about firearm mechanics by mentioning the enemies the player needs to fight their way through. Guns to shoot require targets to shoot at, of course, and the enemies of Sunset Devils do a good job providing that need. While there are only 3 different enemy types in the demo, each behaves differently enough to force the player to adopt different behaviors when engaging. Ordinary bandits provide good fodder to fill out space in the early game. Armed with derringers and single actions, they often engage in run-and-gun tactics, where they will move out of cover, fire off their rounds, and then move to a new position while reloading. They don't close the distance in every scenario they get, preferring to keep to the mid-range. While not particularly difficult, they provide a good foundation for the gunplay to rest on, threatening the player with a reasonable fire rate that can be easily dodged, and moving about enough to get the player accustomed to aiming at moving targets. Shotgunners are the most aggressive of the 3, blasting their close-range shotguns when sighting the player and moving directly towards their enemy at full tilt. While extremely predictable and easy to outrange, their high health means the best strategy to beat them is often to burst them down before they can close the gap. Trappers are the opposite. They're completely content to sit behind cover and peck away at the player with their high ammo count lever guns. As they pop in and out of cover, the best tactic is to time your shots to tag them while they're vulnerable, or to sneak in close and shoot them with nothing in the way. When hit, they also panic and attempt to run away, which is a nice touch to give them a little bit of personality. Altogether, this trio does a lot to diversify the experience, with each filling a particular combat niche, so I'm excited to see what sorts of new enemies are added in the final product. There's a lot of attention to detail in how the bandits handle their weapons as well. Because each one uses their firearms in the same way as the player, mechanically this means you will have some idea how a weapon works before you've even had a chance to shoot it. If you've seen an enemy fire a shotgun, for example, you know the gun has an extremely limited range before you've picked it up, so you don't have to waste any shells testing it out before the real deal. In addition, it seems an effort was made to make the enemies exude a sense of human error and imprecision. Foes with revolvers will frequently attempt a shot from an empty chamber, and enemies of all types can seemingly drop unspent ammo on the ground on accident. What's more, there appears to be a variable timing with which enemies will do the steps to reload their weapons, which is a small but valuable detail. These aspects help your foes feel a bit less one-dimensional than they might have come across as otherwise. It can be strangely refreshing to know that you're not the only one in the desert having trouble with their weapons. From a non-gameplay perspective, the art design can help to imbue the enemies with life. Every variety has a clear visual style, which not only helps to differentiate them easily at a glance, but also flavors their aesthetics to match how they function in-game. The bandits with derringers and revolvers are your typical Western baddies. Their style is reflective of their simple gameplay. They exude a sort of dumb confidence that matches the way they run into the open to take shots at the player. Shotgunners are dressed like rednecks, subconsciously informing you of their aggressive movement with a simple visual trope. They're also larger than the others, which reflects the overwhelming danger they pose when up close. Trappers wear a dapper raccoon pelt hat and a bear trap on their waist, which is indicative of their hunter-like behavior. They also move far less erratically than the other enemy types, instead maintaining a steady rhythm when shooting and reloading. This calm and collected persona is shattered when they get spooked, another nice touch. It's also worth mentioning the ebb and flow that repeatedly occurs as the player travels through the world. Moving between action and downtime isn't exactly a novel invention, of course, but the basic gameplay sequence of the experience is bettered by this pattern. Essentially, combat in Sunset Devils follows a distinct yet simple flow. The player first engages in battle with enemies, whether by sneaking up on them or being found first. What ensues is a fight, either long or short, which is the high point of this gameplay structure. Afterwards, the player is free to pick through the bandits' gear and take what they like, as well as re-preparing their firearms for another battle, which will usually take about as long as the combat encounter itself. This is the low point, where the player isn't in any immediate danger, and the challenge of this segment is good inventory management and detection of dropped resources. Finally, the player travels the map a bit until they bump into another group of enemies. Rinse and repeat. Gameplay loop is a bit of a buzzword, but that's exactly what I'm describing here. Over the course of a minute or two, the player can potentially experience this loop several times. That constant motion from high-stakes scenarios, to calm management, to exploration and positioning, does a massive amount to vary the experience of play. As a result, the moment-to-moment gameplay of Sunset Devils is exceptionally engaging, where players are expected to smoothly work their way through that process. And keep in mind, this is just the demo. I can't wait to see what sorts of expansions on this concept the full game brings. Of course, there's still some kinks to be worked out. There have been plenty of bugs throughout my plays of the demo, ranging from minor visual glitches to game-breaking softlocks that require a restart. This is only to be expected from a game this early in development, of course. I have faith that these sorts of things will be ironed out with time, and with player feedback. On the Sunset Devils Discord, there's a channel you can use to report bugs you've found while playing. If you find anything that needs correction, make sure to post it there so that everyone can benefit. In the time since the Kickstarter's been launched, many important bugs have already been addressed, which is a great sign for the future. However, there are a couple gameplay pieces I want to bring up, in terms of potential for improvement. Picking up unspent ammo off the ground has unfortunate overlap with another mechanic. Grabbing a dropped weapon is also performed with the X key, which is particularly irritating considering dead bandits typically have both guns and ammo lying around them. The game prioritizes grabbing firearms over shells, which means it's often necessary to play Jenga with the guns on the ground in order to get to the rounds lying next to them. Considering the game specifically avoids unnecessary context sensitivity in many of its other areas, it's a shame that this mechanic can feel so sensitive at times. There are several potential fixes to this problem. One could be to have the player automatically pick up rounds as they walk over them, but I'm not fond of this idea. I like that players are required to pay attention to their surroundings after a firefight, and that players that do better in this regard are rewarded with the extra ammo. Removing the necessary action to claim the bullets would significantly diminish this aspect of gameplay. Another idea would be to prioritize picking up shells over weapons if both are in proximity when attempting to pick something up. However, this arguably just presents a less serious version of the same issue. While it's much better in terms of time wasted, it doesn't do much to address the sensitivity issue. While a good enough fix for most situations, my preferred solution is a bit better overall, I feel. Potentially, the action of grabbing bullets could be tied to a separate mechanic, such as crouching. I believe that crouching to pick up ammo fills this role well, for a couple reasons. For one, it's indicative of the action from a visual perspective, and it's far less likely to result in an unintentional input than the X key. Alternatively, the system could use both the pickup key and the crouch action to have the player specify more clearly what they want. If they weren't crouching when they held X, it would prioritize weapons, and if they were, it would prioritize ammo. I could see either of these being implemented as a way to combat the issue described prior. I also want to mention a visual element that presents potential problems, being the nature of overlaps when an object is behind a foreground sprite. Due to the angled top-down view, background sprites such as a dropped gun or ammo packs will be obscured by large structures, such as a building. While a minor annoyance in many cases, it can present a genuine issue for fairness in situations where enemies are blocked from sight. A simple fix would be to outline bandits through walls if they become covered by terrain. In fact, the game already does this to an extent when the player character is hidden away, turning the offending element partially transparent. So it wouldn't be much of a problem to extend it beyond. Maybe a bit of a stronger transparency effect would be helpful as well. Sunset Devils grabbed my attention immediately when I first saw gameplay of it. The way it presented a unique gameplay hindrance to the player, forcing them to become immersed in its gameplay with its purposefully inconvenient weapon mechanics, is something that I'm always on the lookout for when searching for new games to try. If you know anything about my taste in games, my favorites always end up being ones that present an interesting inconvenience in a novel way. Sunset Devils is no exception. It has basically everything I'm looking for in a game, and on a less personal note, it's not designed half bad either. Many of its aspects are very conducive to its goal of presenting an adventure with a mechanically rigorous combat system. The ins and outs of the weapons amplify the effectiveness of the Western adventure, and the less battle-focused segments help the combat hit harder. It's cliché, but it really does make you feel like a cowboy.